Out in Tombstone, and in every dusty ranch around Dragoon Springs, they had a name for her. They called her the Widowmaker. And that name, it stuck to Eleanor Vale like alkali dust on worn-out boots. She was 33 years old, with a quiet grace that could turn a man's head, but a story that would make him turn and run. Two husbands, both in the ground before their time. The first one gone after just a handful of months. The second, not long after that. Folks in town didn't bother with the details. They didn't care how it happened. They only cared that it did. They whispered that death followed Eleanor home like a stray dog with hungry eyes. Kids in the street would dare each other to say her name after sundown, like it was some kind of curse you could summon. Grown men, tough men who'd faced down rustlers and rattlers, would cross to the other side of the street when she walked by. Some said she was cursed. Some said she was dangerous, but not a single soul called her a friend. So Eleanor learned to live alone. She had a small, sturdy cabin by the old well at Dragoon Springs, with nothing but the sighing of the wind for company. She learned to keep her eyes down when she went to town for supplies. She learned to keep her words few and her voice low. She locked her heart up tighter than the cellar door where she kept her winter apples. Life had chiseled her down into something cold, hard, and untouchable. Or at least that's what everyone believed. That's the story they told themselves to make sense of it. But there were long, quiet nights when she'd stare at the dancing flame of her oil lamp until her eyes burned. And there were mornings when the weight of her own solitude felt heavier than a tombstone. She was more than just a ghost story the town told itself. She was a woman drowning in silence. And then came the day the desert decided to give her something she never ever asked for. It gave her a man. He was lying broken in the dirt, the unforgiving Arizona sun beating down on his face, blistering his skin. His name, she'd later learn, was Harlan Briggs. He looked like he'd once been a strong man, a man made of iron and grit. But now he was torn apart by bullets, left for dead on a trail nobody traveled unless they had no other choice. The ground around him was cracked and yellow, and his blood had soaked into the dust, dark and thick like spilled whiskey. His lips were split and dry, his breath was a shallow, ragged thing, and his eyes were barely half shut against the glare. Most folks would have just walked on by, especially a woman like Eleanor, a cursed woman and a dying man. The desert could have swallowed them both whole, and not a soul in Tombstone would have shed a tear. It would have just been another story to whisper over a beer. But Eleanor, she stopped. She stood over him, her shadow falling across his face. She watched him for a long time, longer than she should have. She saw that stubborn, flickering spark deep in his gaze, a spark that said he wasn't ready to be gone just yet. It was a look she recognized. It was the same look she saw in her own reflection some mornings, against every whisper she'd ever heard, against every instinct that told her to protect herself, to just turn around and walk away. She bent down. It took every ounce of her strength to get him up, to drape his arm over her shoulders and drag him back toward her cabin. Each step was a struggle. It felt like she was hauling more than just a man's body. It felt like she was dragging fate itself through the dust, kicking and screaming all the way. When Harlan finally woke, his face was as pale as chalk, and his voice was as rough as gravel scraped across stone. He looked at her, his eyes trying to focus, and he forced out a single chilling line. "You're going to regret this." It wasn't a threat. There was no anger in his voice. It was the simple, weary truth of a man who knew trouble better than he knew his own name. Eleanor just pressed a cool, damp cloth to his wound and said nothing. She didn't have any words that could fix this. For the first time in years, the silence in her little cabin didn't feel empty. It was full of something new. And yet in that silence, something darker lingered. Because if the town was right, if she really was cursed, then saving this man might have been the most dangerous choice of all. And the trouble he was talking about? It might already be on its way. The days that followed in that small, sun-baked cabin were slow and heavy. Eleanor Vale was no nurse, but she knew the basics of keeping a man alive. She'd seen enough death to understand its opposite. She boiled water for cleaning the wounds, tore up old linen sheets for fresh bandages, and spooned thin, salty broth between Harlan's cracked lips when he was too weak to lift his own head. He said very little. She said even less. But the quiet between them was different now. It wasn't the lonely, hollow silence she had lived with for years. This was a shared silence. The kind that has weight. The kind that holds two people in a space together, whether they like it or not. Harlan's body fought a war with itself. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of work on the range, would twitch in his sleep, as if they were still trying to rope a steer or grip the handle of a revolver. Eleanor saw how he clenched his jaw while he slept, how his breath would catch and hitch whenever the pain from the bullet wound in his chest flared too deep. Once, as she was dabbing away a trickle of fresh blood from the bandage, his eyes snapped open. He stared at her, and for a fleeting moment, he looked almost ashamed. Ashamed to be so helpless, so broken. For a man like Harlan Briggs, a man clearly carved from the rugged earth itself, having to lean on someone else must have felt like a mortal sin. Eleanor, for her part, tried her best not to care. She tried to keep that distance, that wall she had built around herself brick by painful brick. She kept reminding herself of the whispers. Widowmaker. She remembered the cold feel of the shovels in her hands, the dark soil, the two wooden crosses that marked her past. But it was no use. Every time she heard Harlan fight for another breath, every time his lips moved in his sleep, as if he were chasing ghosts through some forgotten nightmare, something deep inside her, something she thought had died long ago, began to soften. Against her better judgment, she started waiting for his eyes to open in the morning. Sometimes when she was stirring the stew over the fire, she'd find herself humming a quiet, forgotten tune, just to fill the room with something warmer than silence. It was a dangerous feeling, this flicker of warmth. It was hope, and hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. On the third evening, Harlan asked for water. His voice was still gravel, but there was more life in it, a flicker of the iron she'd first sensed in him. He propped himself up on one elbow and studied her in the dim, flickering lamplight, his eyes sharp and assessing, as if he was trying to figure out exactly where fate had decided to dump him. She met his gaze for only a second before looking away, her hand tightening around the tin cup. She handed it to him, their fingers brushing for a moment. A jolt, like lightning on a dry plain, passed between them. He took a sip of the water and then immediately choked, coughing so hard the water sloshed over the rim of the cup and onto the wooden floor. It was a raw, rattling sound that echoed in the small space. Eleanor just gave him a sharp look. It was the kind of look a woman gives when she wants to laugh but has forgotten how. Or maybe the kind of look she gives when she refuses to let herself feel anything at all. For just a moment, the cabin felt less like a sick room and more like a place where life still had a fighting chance. It wasn't love, not even close. It was something far more fragile, far more dangerous. It was a tiny spark between two people who thought they had nothing left to lose. But here's the thing that should keep you leaning forward. Here's the secret that was buried deep in their past, a secret neither of them knew they shared. They had no idea that the very same shadow, the very same darkness that had shattered both of their lives, was at that very moment riding towards them. They didn't know that by saving this one man, Eleanor was about to stir up ghosts she thought she had buried for good. Ghosts that were about to come walking right through her front door. Peace never lasts long at West. It has a nasty habit of slipping through your fingers like a handful of dry sand. For a few days in that isolated cabin, Harlan Briggs and Eleanor Vale existed in something that felt almost like quiet. But quiet in the desert can fool you. It can make you think you're safe. It's never a question of if trouble comes, only when. That evening the air was hot and heavy, the kind of oppressive heat that makes the wooden walls of a cabin feel like they're sweating. Eleanor had just stepped outside to draw a fresh bucket of water from the old well when she saw it. A shape on the trail, a rider. He was moving slow, deliberate, too steady to be a lost traveler, too confident to be a friendly visitor. Her stomach turned to ice. A cold dread, a feeling she knew all too well, crept up her spine. By the time the stranger had tied his horse to her fence post, Harlan was already sitting bolt upright in the bed, a hand pressed tight against his wounded chest, his eyes sharp and alert despite the pain. He knew. He knew who this was. The man who stood in her doorway was Jed Carter. Folks in Arizona knew his name. even if they'd been lucky enough to never see his face. He was a bounty hunter once, or so the stories went, but now he was more outlaw than lawman. He had the kind of cruel, easy smile that never ever reached his cold, dead eyes. He stepped inside without asking permission, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. His gaze wandered over the small cabin, taking in every detail, before it finally fixed on Eleanor. She froze, feeling like a rabbit caught in the shadow of a circling hawk. Carter talked low and easy, his voice like the dry rustle of a snake moving through tall grass. He said he'd heard stories, stories of a dying man being dragged out of the desert, patched up by a cursed widow. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Said it was funny how fate had a way of gathering all the broken things in one place. Then he looked at Harlan, and his smile stretched wider, showing a row of yellowed teeth. He started talking about debts, unpaid debts. He talked about old trails where blood had already been spilled. He spoke of promises that had been broken. Eleanor felt her knees start to tremble, but Harlan, he pushed himself up straighter, his face a grim mask of defiance. His voice, when he finally spoke, cracked like a piece of dry wood. "You'll have to go through me first." There was no bravado in it. It wasn't a hero's challenge. It was just the sound of a man who knew, deep in his bones, that he had absolutely nothing left to lose. Carter laughed. It was a slow, cruel sound that seemed to crawl under your skin and make a home there. He didn't draw his gun, not yet. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the weight of fear in a room far more than the kick of a colt. He circled them, not with his feet, but with his words. Words as sharp as freshly honed knives. He started hinting at things. Truths Eleanor had spent years trying to bury. He dangled them in the air like bait on a hook, watching her, waiting for her to flinch. He talked about her first husband, Thomas, and then he talked about her second husband, Samuel. He spoke their names like he knew them, like he'd been there. And for the first time in years, the cabin that had been her shelter, her fortress of solitude, suddenly felt smaller and tighter than a coffin. If you're watching this right now, you can feel it too, can't you? That tightening in your chest. That sense that something terrible, something unstoppable, is about to break. And trust me, you do not want to miss the moment it does. If stories like this, stories of grit and ghosts from the Old West, hold you the way they hold me, you might want to go ahead and hit that subscribe button before we ride any further into this storm. Because every turn this tale takes digs deeper into the dark heart of the past. And I promise you, what's coming next will keep you leaning in, holding your breath. That night the desert fell quiet in a way that pressed down on your ears. Out there under the cold, indifferent light of the Arizona moon, it felt like even the coyotes were holding their breath. Inside Eleanor's cabin, the air was thick, heavy with the smell of lamp oil, sweat, and the ghosts of gunpowder. Jed Carter hadn't left. He was leaning against the doorframe, his boots caked in dust, that same cold smile plastered on his face. He looked like he had all the time in the world. He was a patient predator. He knew that fear, when applied correctly, could work slower and more painfully than any bullet. And he liked it that way. Harlan was propped up against the wall, his shirt still dark with the stain of old blood. He had his revolver resting in his lap, the metal catching the lamplight. He was weak, you could see it in the pallor of his skin, but his eyes never left Carter. They were as steady as fence posts sunk deep in hard ground. Eleanor stood by the small wooden table, her hands flat on its surface, trying to keep them from shaking. She had lived with whispers and stares for years. She had faced down the scorn of an entire town. But this was different. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a monster, breathing the same air she was, right inside her home. Carter's voice rolled on, slow and easy. He talked about men he had known, men he had killed. He talked about trails that had been painted red with blood. He talked about how some folks were just meant to outlive others, as if it were a natural law, like gravity or sunrise. Every single word was a weapon. Every sentence was meant to cut. He was reminding Harlan that he was already half dead. He was reminding Eleanor that everything she touched seemed to wither and turn to loss. He laughed, a short, sharp bark, when he saw her flinch at the mention of her second husband's name. The lamp on the table flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it rattled the shutters like a restless spirit. For a single stretched-out heartbeat, nobody moved. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Then Carter shifted his weight, pushing himself off the doorframe. And in that tiny movement, the tension in the room snapped as tight as a coiled rope. Harlan lifted his revolver. His hand was trembling from the effort, from the weakness in his body. Carter's smile only widened. This was the part he loved, the game. He drew his own gun, but he did it slow, savoring the moment, savoring the fear in Eleanor's eyes. He was certain his speed would end this little drama before it even began. But Eleanor didn't freeze this time. She didn't scream. The years of being called a curse, of being treated like a monster, had forged something hard and sharp inside of her. With one quick, desperate breath, she blew out the lamp. The cabin was plunged into absolute suffocating blackness, and the darkness exploded with sound. The scrape of a boot on wood, the sharp metallic click of a hammer being pulled back, and then the deafening crack of a gunshot. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air, acrid and choking. For long, terrifying seconds, there was only the ringing in Eleanor's ears. No one knew who had fallen. Then a heavy body hit the floorboards with a dull, final thud. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any thunder. Eleanor's heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out a trembling hand into the darkness, her fingers brushing against Harlan's shoulder. He was still there, still sitting up, still breathing. On the floor near the doorway, a man groaned. It was Carter. His laughter was broken now, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound. The bullet had found him. His voice, when it came, was a rasp, bitter and cold with his last ounce of life. "This ain't over," he choked out, his words directed not at Harlan, but at her. Not for her. For a man like Jed Carter, even dying words were meant to be a weapon, a final, poisoned dart. If you're watching this, ask yourself, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have had the nerve to blow out that lamp? Or would fear have nailed your boots to the floor? It's in moments like those, in the heart of the darkness, that stories hold us tightest. And trust me, what comes next, what's revealed in the light of the morning sun, is something you do not want to miss. Because Carter's last words weren't just a threat, they were a clue. When the sun finally rose over Dragoon Springs, it cast a light that felt different, sharper, cleaner. The cabin still smelled of gun smoke and fear, and the floorboards by the door bore the dark, ugly stain of blood. But there was also a quiet relief in the air, the kind of relief that only comes after you've survived a night you were sure was going to be your last. Jed Carter was gone. They had dragged his body outside, a grim reminder that evil can walk right into your home when you least expect it. But he was gone all the same. Harlan Briggs sat on the edge of the porch, his face battered and pale, but he was alive. Eleanor Vale stood by the well, her hands raw from scrubbing, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. But they were steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what the town whispered behind her back. This morning, she wasn't the widowmaker. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had chosen to fight and who had not fought alone. But Carter's final words echoed in her mind. This ain't over. Not for her. What did he mean? Harlan looked at her, his expression grim. He wasn't just here for me, Eleanor, or some old debt. He winced as he shifted his weight. He was here for something else, something your first husband, Thomas, was involved in. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Thomas, her first husband, a man she had tried so hard to forget. He wasn't a good man. He was a drinker, a gambler, with a mean streak as wide as the territory. His death in a supposed saloon brawl had been a quiet relief, but the town had twisted it, made it the first chapter of her curse. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Thomas," Harlan said, his eyes meeting hers. "He didn't die in a random fight. He was part of Carter's gang. They'd robbed a silver shipment from the Pine Ridge mine. Thomas was killed because he was about to run off with the whole score." The world tilted under Eleanor's feet. Her entire past was a lie. "But that's not all," Harlan continued, his voice low. "Carter didn't just kill him. He and his men, they started the rumors about you." Eleanor stared at him, uncomprehending. The curse, Harlan said, the words hanging heavy in the morning air. The Widowmaker. It was all a lie. A story Carter invented. He wanted you isolated. He wanted everyone in town to be afraid of you, to stay away from this cabin. But why? She breathed. Harlan looked past her, his gaze fixed on the old stone well in her yard. Because Thomas hid the silver before Carter could get to him, and Carter was convinced he hid it somewhere on this property. He spread the story of the curse to keep people away, so he could come back and search for it himself whenever he wanted. Her entire life as an outcast, the years of loneliness, the averted eyes, the whispers, the fear, it was all a fabrication, a cruel, calculated lie designed to guard a treasure she never even knew existed. She wasn't cursed. She was a smokescreen, a ghost story invented by thieves. Then another colder realization hit her. She looked at Harlan, a new suspicion dawning in her eyes. How do you know all this? Were you one of them? Harlan couldn't meet her gaze. He looked down at his own calloused hands. Yes, he admitted, his voice thick with shame. I was there. I was Thomas's partner. The man she had saved. The man she had nursed back from the brink of death. He was one of them. He was part of the lie that had destroyed her life. And in that moment, the fragile spark that had flickered between them was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of betrayal. The monster was dead, but she might have been sheltering another one all along. The silence that fell between them now was the worst kind of all. It was the silence of a truth that was too terrible to speak aloud. The morning sun climbed higher, baking the dusty ground, but a chilling cold had settled deep in Eleanor's bones. She stood there, staring at Harlan, the man she had pulled from the jaws of death, and all she could see was a ghost from a past she never knew she had. You were his partner, she said, the words flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. Harlan finally looked up, and the shame in his eyes was raw, undeniable. I was, he said. Thomas and me. We ran together. We did things. Things I ain't proud of. The silver robbery was supposed to be our last job. One big score, and we'd disappear. But he tried to double-cross you, Eleanor finished for him, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. That saloon brawl. It wasn't a brawl, was it? He shook his head slowly. Carter arranged it, made it look like a drunken fight. But it was an execution. I got away. Carter thought I ran with my share, but I never got a dime. I've been looking over my shoulder ever since. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. And my second husband? Samuel? Her voice was a fragile whisper. Samuel had been kind, a quiet man who had married her when no one else would even look at her. He had died of a sudden, violent fever. The town doctor, old and weary, had just shaken his head and called it God's will. Another victim of the Widowmaker's curse. Carter mentioned his name, she pressed, her voice gaining a sharp, desperate edge. How did Carter know Samuel? Harlan's face grew even grimmer. I don't know for sure, but after I was shot, before I passed out, I heard Carter's men talking. They said something about how they'd taken care of the second one, too. They said he was getting too close, asking too many questions. A wave of nausea washed over Eleanor. Samuel hadn't been a victim of her curse. He had been murdered. He had likely figured something out, started digging into Thomas's death, and Carter had silenced him. The corrupt tendrils of this conspiracy reached further than she could have ever imagined. The town doctor. Was it possible? Had he lied about the cause of death? Was he one of Carter's men too? She was living in a town of ghosts and liars. Why did you come back here? She demanded, her gaze hard as flint. After all these years, why come back to Dragoon Springs? Not for the silver, he said quickly, his voice earnest. I swear it, Eleanor. I came back for you. She let out a short, bitter laugh. For me? You helped create the lie that ruined my life. I know, he said, his voice cracking, and I've lived with that every single day. I came back to try and make it right. I heard Carter was back in the territory, sniffing around again. I thought I could find a way to expose him, to prove what he did. To clear your name. That's when his men found me on the trail. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn vest, his movements slow and pained. He pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. He held it out to her. She recognized it instantly. It had been her mother's. She had buried it with Thomas, a final, futile gesture to a man she had once tried to love. "Where did you get this?" she breathed. "I took it off him," Harlan confessed. "That night, after the fight, I kept it all these years, as a reminder of what I owed you." The locket lay in his palm, a symbol of every lie she had ever been told. It represented a dead husband she didn't mourn, a curse that was a fiction, and a life of solitude that had been forced upon her. And the man holding it was both the cause of her damnation and perhaps her only path to salvation. She looked from the locket in his hand to the old well in the yard. The well Carter believed held a fortune in stolen silver. The answers were here. All of them. The silver, the truth about Samuel, the key to dismantling the lie that had become her life. They were all buried somewhere on this small patch of cursed ground, and she realized, with a terrifying clarity, that digging them up would be more dangerous than facing a dozen men like Jed Carter. Because some truths, once unearthed, can never be buried again. They didn't speak for a long time after that. The weight of Harlan's confession settled over the small cabin, heavier than the midday heat. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and a strange, terrifying flicker of hope. He had lied. He had been part of it all. But he had also come back. He had carried her mother's locket for years like a penance. Finally, she broke the silence. "The well," she said, her voice steady. "If Carter was so sure the silver was here?" Harlan nodded, understanding her unspoken question. "Thomas was clever. He wouldn't have just buried it in the dirt. The well makes sense. It's deep. It's on your land. And with the whole town thinking this place was cursed, no one would ever come snooping around. They needed rope, and they needed light. The sun was high, but the dark, narrow shaft of the well would swallow the daylight just a few feet down." Eleanor fetched a long, sturdy coil of rope from the shed and tied it securely to the wellhead. Harlan, despite his wounds, insisted on helping. He found 2 oil lamps, filled them, and trimmed the wicks. Working together, they lowered the first lamp into the darkness. The small flame descended, a tiny star against the suffocating black, illuminating the damp, moss-covered stones of the well wall. It went down 10 feet, then 20, then 30. The water level was low, as it always was this time of year, leaving a wide, muddy basin at the bottom. "See anything?" Eleanor asked, her hands gripping the edge of the well. "Nothing but mud and rock," Harlan grunted, squinting into the depths. They had to go down. Harlan was in no shape to make the descent. His wound would surely tear open. It had to be her. The thought of being lowered into that dark, enclosed space made her skin crawl. But the thought of living one more day as the Widowmaker was worse. "Lower me," she said, her voice firm. Harlan started to protest, but he saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had before she blew out the lamp. It was the look of a woman who had made up her mind. He fashioned a loop in the rope for her to sit in and another for her to hold. Slowly, painfully, he began to lower her into the earth. The world above shrank to a perfect circle of blue sky. The air grew cool and damp, smelling of wet stone and dark soil. The flickering lamplight at the bottom cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Her feet finally touched the soft, slick mud. The bottom of the well was wider than she expected. The lamp revealed a space maybe 10 feet across. She untied herself from the rope and began to search, her boots sinking into the muck. She ran her hands along the cold, slimy stones of the foundation, looking for anything out of place. A loose rock, a hidden cavity. Nothing. It was just a well. "Anything?" Harlan's voice echoed down from above, sounding distant and hollow. "No!" she called back, frustration creeping into her voice. "There's nothing here." Was it possible? Had Carter been wrong? Had they risked everything for nothing? She kicked at a large flat stone, half buried in the mud, her anger boiling over. The stone shifted, not much, just an inch or two. But it moved in a way a settled foundation stone shouldn't. Her heart hammered in her chest. She knelt down, digging her fingers into the cold mud around the edges of the stone. It was heavy, but it wasn't cemented in place. It was a cover. Using all her strength, she pried it up, sliding it sideways with a wet, sucking sound. Beneath it was a hollow space, and inside that space, glinting in the lamplight, were two heavy canvas sacks, and beside them, a small, oilskin-wrapped package. She reached for one of the sacks, her fingers trembling. The weight of it was immense. She loosened the drawstring and tilted it. A stream of heavy silver coins poured into her muddy hands. It was real, the Pine Ridge silver. Then she reached for the small oilskin package. It was light. She carefully unwrapped the layers. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise, and she recognized it immediately. It wasn't Thomas's. It wasn't Harlan's. It was Samuel's, her kind, quiet second husband. Why was his journal hidden here, with a fortune in stolen silver? She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. They started out simple. Observations about the weather, the town, about her. Then they grew more frantic. He wrote about his suspicions concerning Thomas's death. He mentioned Jed Carter's name. He wrote that he had spoken to the town doctor, and the doctor's story kept changing. Then she found the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. He knows. The doctor knows I'm on to him. He gave me a tonic for my cough. Said it would help me sleep. But I feel cold. So cold. I know what he's done. I forced him to write a confession. If you are reading this, Eleanor, it is hidden with the silver. He was working for Carter. They all were. The whole story is a lie. They killed me to protect it. Don't let them get away with it. I love you. The journal slipped from her fingers, falling into the mud. Her husband hadn't died from a fever. He had been poisoned, and in his final moments, he had solved his own murder. He had found the silver, and he had left her the truth as his final gift. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Tucked into the back of the journal was a single folded piece of paper, the doctor's confession, and beneath it, something else, a small, faded tin-type photograph. She held it up to the lamplight. It was a picture of two young men grinning, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. One of them was a younger, cockier Jed Carter. The other man was the town doctor. They were brothers. The man who had signed Samuel's death certificate was the brother of the man who had ordered his murder. The conspiracy didn't just run deep in this town. It was a family affair, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Climbing out of that well was like being reborn into a nightmare. Eleanor's hands were scraped raw, her clothes were caked in mud, but it was the cold weight of the truth that chilled her to the bone. She emerged into the blinding sunlight, holding Samuel's journal and the doctor's confession, her face a mask of grim resolve. Harlan saw the look in her eyes and knew immediately. You found it. I found everything, she said, her voice hollow. She explained what she'd read, the poisoning, the confession, the photograph of Jed Carter and Dr. Miller. Brothers. Harlan slammed his fist against the wellhead, a surge of rage overriding the pain in his chest. Miller, that snake. He was in on it from the beginning. He must have been the one who told Carter that Samuel was asking questions. The entire town had been a cage, and the bars were made of lies told by men they were supposed to trust. They had the proof, the confession, the silver, Samuel's journal. But what could they do? The local sheriff, a lazy man named Cobb, was known to be friendly with Dr. Miller. Taking the evidence to him would be like handing a rabbit back to the wolves. They would be dead before sundown, and the evidence would disappear forever. We can't go to the law in Tombstone, Harlan said, thinking aloud. Cobb would bury this so fast it would make your head spin. Then we go around him, Eleanor said, a new hardness in her voice. We go to Prescott, to the U.S. Marshals. They won't be in Carter's or Miller's pocket. It was a long, dangerous ride, 2 days at least, and they would be exposed the entire way. Dr. Miller would soon realize that Jed Carter wasn't coming back. He would get nervous. He might come looking for his brother. When he found him dead, the first place he would come would be here. They didn't have much time. They hauled the heavy sacks of silver out of the well. They hitched up Eleanor's old rickety wagon and loaded the silver. hiding it beneath a pile of empty grain sacks. They took Jed Carter's body, wrapping it in a canvas tarp and securing it in the back. A dead outlaw was a powerful piece of evidence. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the desert, they were ready to leave. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her cabin, the place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, for one last time. She was leaving behind the ghost of the Widowmaker. She didn't know what she was riding towards, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was riding towards a future, not just running from a past. "Are you ready for this?" Harlan asked, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. She looked at him, the man who had been her husband's partner in crime, the man who had worn the face of her enemy. But he was also the man who had come back, who had fought for her, who had put the truth in her hands. Their past was a tangled, bloody mess, but their present was this wagon, this mission, this one single chance at justice. "I'm ready," she said. They set out under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, taking the rough, forgotten trails that wound through the jagged hills. Every snapping twig, every cry of a distant coyote sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were fugitives carrying a dead man, a fortune, and a truth that could get them killed. The first night passed without incident. By midday on the second day, they were nearing the Black Canyon Trail, a notoriously treacherous stretch of land known for ambushes and rock slides. It was the last major hurdle before the open plains that led to Prescott. They were rounding a tight bend, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side of them, when Harlan suddenly pulled the horses to a halt. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. About 100 yards down the trail, a horse stood alone, its reins dangling in the dust. There was no rider in sight. It was a trap, too obvious. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. A bullet splintered the wood of the wagon seat, inches from Eleanor's head. They weren't being followed. They had ridden right into an ambush. From the rocks above, 3 men appeared, their rifles leveled at the wagon. And standing beside them, a pistol in his hand, was a man Eleanor recognized with a jolt of ice-cold dread. It wasn't Dr. Miller. It wasn't one of Carter's thugs. It was Sheriff Cobb, the lawman from Tombstone. "Evening, folks," the sheriff called down, a smug grin on his face. "Looks like you're carrying something that belongs to me. Or rather, my dear friend Dr. Miller." He wasn't just friendly with the doctor. He was part of it. The corruption in Tombstone didn't just run deep. It wore a badge. They were trapped. The law itself stood between them and the truth. And in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear them scream, justice was just a word. The only law out here was the one that came from the barrel of a gun. "Drop the rifle, Briggs!" Sheriff Cobb shouted from the ridge, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "And you, Mrs. Vale, step away from the wagon, nice and slow." Harlan's hands tightened on his rifle. They were pinned down, 3 rifles on the ridge, and the sheriff. 4-1, and the enemy held the high ground. It was a losing fight. "Don't do it, Harlan," Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting around, searching for any possible cover. There was none. They were sitting ducks in the middle of the trail. "He'll kill us anyway," Harlan muttered back, his jaw tight. "He can't let us get to Prescott. Not with what we're carrying." He was right. They weren't meant to be taken prisoner. This was an execution. Cobb couldn't risk a trial. He couldn't risk Samuel's journal getting into the hands of the marshals. "I've got an idea," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "It's crazy, but it's all I've got." She looked at the heavy canvas tarp covering Jed Carter's body. Then she looked at the steep, rocky incline on the other side of the trail. "When I move, you give them something to shoot at." Before Harlan could ask what she meant, she acted. With a sudden, desperate movement, she grabbed the edge of the tarp and yanked it off Carter's body, revealing the dead outlaw in the back of the wagon. "We've got Jed Carter's body!" she screamed up at the men on the ridge, her voice filled with a calculated panic. "There's a $500 bounty on him. We're taking him to the marshals." For a split second, there was confusion on the ridge. The 3 hired guns weren't local. They were just thugs, likely paid by Cobb and Miller. The mention of a bounty of U.S. Marshals was enough to make them hesitate. Greed and fear were powerful motivators. That split second was all Harlan needed. He fired his rifle not at the men, but at the rocks just above their heads. Chips of stone exploded outwards, forcing them to duck for cover. In that same instant, Eleanor vaulted over the side of the wagon, landing hard on the dusty ground. She scrambled towards the steep incline, digging her fingers and toes into the loose rock and scrub brush, pulling herself up the treacherous slope. Another shot rang out from the ridge, kicking up dust where she had just been. Harlan fired back, providing cover, the shots echoing like thunder in the narrow canyon. Eleanor kept climbing, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. She wasn't trying to get to the top. She was aiming for a large, unstable-looking overhang of rock about 30 feet up, directly above the trail where the wagon sat. Sheriff Cobb realized what was happening. He saw that Harlan was just a distraction. He turned his attention to the real threat. He saw Eleanor clawing her way up the rock face. "Forget him! Get the woman!" Cobb roared. A bullet whizzed past Eleanor's ear, so close she could feel the heat of its passage. Another struck the rock just beside her hand, showering her with stinging fragments. But she didn't stop. She was almost there. She reached the overhang, her fingers finding a precarious grip. Below her, Harlan fired his last shot. The terrible click of an empty chamber followed. He was defenseless. Sheriff Cobb took aim, a triumphant sneer on his face. This was the end. But Eleanor had reached her goal. With the last of her strength, she pushed against the base of the rock overhang. It was loose, weathered by years of wind and rain. It shifted, it groaned, and then, with a deep, rumbling crack, it gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down onto the trail below. It wasn't a massive landslide, but it was enough. It crashed down right in front of the wagon, completely blocking the path. A thick cloud of dust filled the air, obscuring everything. The men on the ridge were cut off. They couldn't get a clear shot. Eleanor slid back down the slope in the chaos, landing in a heap behind the newly formed rockfall. The dust was choking, but it provided perfect cover. "The horses!" Harlan yelled, already cutting them free from the wagon traces. They left the wagon. They left the silver. They left Carter's body. They took only the horses, Samuel's journal, and the confession. Throwing themselves onto the horses' backs, they galloped away, back the way they came, leaving Sheriff Cobb and his men trapped behind a wall of their own making. They had escaped, but they had lost the silver. And now Cobb and Miller knew for certain what they were carrying. They weren't just running from a conspiracy anymore. They were being hunted, and they had just shown their enemies exactly how dangerous they could be. The ride to Prescott was no longer a mission for justice. It was a race for their lives. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits, not stopping until the sun had bled from the sky, and a blanket of stars was cast over the desert. They found a small hidden box canyon to make camp, a place where they could see anyone coming from a long way off. They were exhausted, bruised, but they were alive. Harlan tended to the horses while Eleanor built a small, smokeless fire. The warmth did little to chase away the chill of fear. "He won't give up," Harlan said, his voice low as he stared into the flames. "Cobb will send a telegraph to every lawman between here and Prescott. He'll paint us as fugitives, murderers who killed him and his deputies and stole a wagon. He'll twist the story." "Let him," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held up the oilskin pouch containing the journal and the confession. "This is the only story that matters now. We just have to live long enough to tell it." They sat in silence for a while, the vastness of the desert night pressing in on them. "Eleanor," Harlan began, his voice hesitant, "back there, what you did, I've never seen anything like it." She looked at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "For years, this town, those men, they made me feel helpless. They made me a ghost in my own life. I'm just tired of being afraid." "I know I don't have the right to ask this," he said, the words coming out slow and heavy. "But when this is over, if we make it, I want to make things right, not just by clearing your name, but for what I did, for my part in all of it." Before she could answer, a sound cut through the night, the distant, unmistakable sound of shod horses on rock. And it was coming from the direction of the canyon mouth. They weren't distant. They were close. Instantly, they doused the fire, plunging their small camp into darkness. Harlan grabbed his rifle, which he'd managed to reload, and Eleanor drew the small pistol she had taken from Jed Carter's body. They pressed themselves against the cold rock wall of the canyon, their hearts pounding in unison. Two riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the starry sky. They moved slowly, cautiously. "They couldn't have tracked us this fast," Harlan whispered. "Not in the dark." Which meant only one thing. They weren't being tracked. Someone had been waiting for them. Someone knew where they would go. One of the riders dismounted and lit a lantern. The warm yellow light washed over his face. It was Dr. Miller. And the man beside him, the man holding a rifle, was the Tombstone Sheriff, Sheriff Cobb. But that was impossible. They had left him trapped behind the rock slide. There's no way he could have beaten them here. "How?" Eleanor breathed, her mind reeling. "There must be another trail," Harlan hissed. "A shortcut through the hills. They know this land better than we do." Cobb and Miller advanced into the canyon, the lantern light bobbing, casting long, dancing shadows. "I know you're in here," Cobb's voice boomed, bouncing off the rocks. "There's no way out. Give us the journal, and the doctor will see to it your deaths are quick." Dr. Miller said nothing. He just stood there in his town clothes, holding the lantern, looking completely out of place, yet more menacing than any outlaw. He was the man who had poisoned her husband, the man who had smiled at her and offered his condolences while knowing he was a murderer. Rage, pure and hot, burned through Eleanor. "This ends tonight," she whispered to Harlan. "One way or another." They were trapped in a dead-end canyon, 2 guns against 2. But this wasn't the open trail. This was close quarters, a place of rock and shadow, a place where a ghost could fight back. The canyon was a tomb of rock and shadow. The only light came from the single lantern held by Dr. Miller, its glow painting his face in a sickly yellow. Sheriff Cobb moved forward, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the darkness. "No sense in hiding," Cobb yelled, his voice laced with impatience. "Just make it easy on yourselves." Harlan and Eleanor were pressed flat against the canyon wall, hidden behind a large cluster of boulders. They were out of options. There was no retreat, no escape. This was the final stand. "I'll take the sheriff," Harlan whispered, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "You have to get the doctor. He's the one holding the light. Without it, we have the advantage." Eleanor nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped Jed Carter's pistol. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked at Miller, the man who had murdered Samuel, with a gentle smile and a bottle of poison. This wasn't just for survival. This was for him. Harlan took a deep breath, raised his rifle over the top of the boulder, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed at the rock wall just beside Cobb, a warning shot that exploded in a shower of stone splinters. Cobb cursed and dove for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. In that same moment, Eleanor broke from their hiding spot. She didn't run towards Miller. She ran sideways, deeper into the shadows along the canyon wall, circling around them. "She's over there!" Cobb shouted, seeing the flicker of movement. He and Miller turned their attention and their weapons in her direction. It was exactly what Harlan had been waiting for. With their backs turned to him, Harlan rose from behind the boulder and took careful aim. He didn't shoot at Cobb. He shot at the lantern in Dr. Miller's hand. The bullet struck true. There was a tinkle of shattering glass, a brief flare of burning oil, and then the canyon was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. A scream of pain came from Miller as the hot oil splashed his hand. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted, blind and disoriented. "Where are they?" Cobb's voice was tight with panic. Eleanor didn't hesitate. In the disorienting blackness, she kept moving, her feet sure on the rocky ground. She knew the layout of the canyon better than they did. She had chosen this spot. She heard a sound to her left, a man stumbling, cursing under his breath. It was Miller. He was closer than she thought. She raised the pistol and fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the doctor's terrified face for a split second, his eyes wide with shock. He crumpled to the ground with a soft groan, the lantern falling from his burned hand. One down. Now it was just Cobb. He was somewhere in the darkness, and he was dangerous. "You'll pay for that, you witch!" he roared, firing his rifle wildly. The bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall with a high-pitched whine. Eleanor dropped to the ground, pressing herself against the cold stone. She could hear Harlan moving on the other side of the canyon, a shadow among shadows, drawing Cobb's attention. It was the same strategy from the cabin: darkness and distraction. "Over here, Sheriff," Harlan called out, his voice acting as a lure. Cobb spun around and fired in the direction of the sound. The gunshot gave away his position, and that was the mistake Eleanor was waiting for. She rose to her feet, took 3 quick steps to get a clear line of sight, and fired Carter's pistol one last time. The shot echoed, and then there was silence, a profound, ringing silence. Slowly, Harlan lit a match. The tiny flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. In its fragile light, they saw Dr. Miller, wounded but alive, clutching his leg. A few yards away, Sheriff Cobb lay on the ground, his eyes wide and staring at the stars. He was not getting up again. It was over. They tied up Dr. Miller, using his own belt. As the first hint of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, they stood over the 2 men who had been the architects of so much pain. "What now?" Harlan asked, his voice weary. Eleanor looked at the oilskin pouch, still clutched in her hand. Then she looked towards the trail that led to Prescott. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "we go tell the truth." Riding into Prescott was like entering a different world. It was a bustling territorial capital, full of uniformed soldiers, serious-looking men in suits, and the imposing stone facade of the U.S. Marshal's office. It was a place where the law felt real, not like the cheap, tarnished badge worn by a man like Cobb. They walked into the Marshal's office looking like ghosts from the desert. They were covered in dust and grime, their faces etched with exhaustion. They had Dr. Miller tied between their horses, and they carried Samuel's journal like a holy relic. They were met by a tall, stern-faced marshal with a thick gray mustache and eyes that had seen everything. His name was Marshal John Bridges. He listened to their story, his expression unreadable, his gaze shifting from Eleanor's determined face to Harlan's wary one, and then to the damning pages of the journal. He read the doctor's confession. He looked at the tin-type photograph. He listened to them describe the ambush in the canyon, the corruption of Sheriff Cobb, and the years of lies that had poisoned the town of Tombstone. When they were finished, the office was silent. Marshal Bridges stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the street for a long time. Finally, he turned back to them. "I've been hearing whispers about Sheriff Cobb for months," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Whispers of bribes and men disappearing. But I never had anything solid to act on." He looked down at the journal in his hands. "Until now." He sent 2 of his best deputies to Tombstone. They found Jed Carter's body in the abandoned wagon behind the rock slide. They found the silver. And when they arrested the other men from the ambush, they confessed everything, eager to save their own skins. The entire conspiracy came crashing down. Eleanor Vale's name was cleared. The story of the Widowmaker was replaced by the true story, a story of murder, greed, and a woman who refused to remain a victim. The people of Tombstone were forced to look at the woman they had shunned and see not a curse, but a survivor. Some looked ashamed. Some offered quiet, clumsy apologies. Eleanor didn't need their approval, but the weight of their scorn was finally lifted from her shoulders. Harlan Briggs faced his own judgment. He confessed his role in the Pine Ridge robbery years ago. Because of his testimony against Carter's gang and his actions in helping Eleanor, the marshal showed him leniency. He served a short sentence, his time reduced for his cooperation in bringing down a far greater evil. The reward for the recovered silver and the bounty on Jed Carter and his men was given to Eleanor. It was a small fortune, enough for a new start, enough to leave Dragoon Springs and its ghosts behind forever. A few months later, she stood on the porch of the cabin one last time, waiting. A rider appeared on the trail. It was Harlan. He was free. He swung down from his horse, looking older, wearier, but with a new light in his eyes. There were no grand declarations of love. There were no promises of a perfect future carved into wood. Their past was too scarred for that. But as they stood there side by side under the vast Arizona sky, there was a shared silence between them. Not the empty silence of loneliness or the heavy silence of secrets. It was a quiet, peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a long and terrible storm, the kind that feels like healing. Maybe that's the real lesson here, that even when the world calls you cursed, even when loss tries to write your name in stone, there's always a chance for another chapter. The truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a way of fighting its way to the light. And sometimes the very people we think are villains in our story are just waiting for a chance to help us write a better ending. Do you believe people can find redemption even after a lifetime of mistakes? Can a reputation, once destroyed, ever be truly rebuilt? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of the Wild West, of grit, loss, and the quiet strength it takes to survive, moved you, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more tales from the forgotten corners of history, stories that dig up the truth and serve justice, cold and hard, then make sure you hit subscribe. Because out here in the dust and the shadows, there are 1,000 more tales waiting to be told, and each one might just change the way you see the world.